episode of Debt Nation, where we're putting death out of business. We have a very cool episode here because we have Ben Zion, obviously, who's on the campaign trail. He's up in Washington campaigning very hard. So much to talk about on that campaign trail. It's been so much fun. And then we also have Mr. Yeluashvili here for an appointment and a talk on climate change. Everyone can see you. He can't see us, so it's kind of like he's in a little bit of a dark, but it's all good. We'll work through that. Skype is its own monster, as we know. The guys at Microsoft doing an interesting job over there with their communication software. But anyway, so this episode we're going to concentrate on a USTP appointment, and we're also going to get a campaign update. So let's rock into the news. Ben Zion, you're in Washington. How did you end up in Washington? How's your campaign going up so far? What have you been doing? You've been giving speeches. You've been on the road. You called in with Charlie Cam. You're on the road. Give the people the update before we rock into this appointment.
Yes. So I'm here in Washington, D.C. and in North Bethesda at the moment, but been making the rounds at Washington, D.C. We've got to go to a Singularity University a meeting, which was really incredible. I got to attend some events of interest at the NIH, including a talk on the brain-computer interfaces from Dr. Miguel Nicolelis, who's done incredible work in this area. Got to ask him a question in front of this large audience, which is very interesting. Some people might have seen that video also. Doing things of this kind, all in anticipation of the main events this weekend. Tomorrow is our live stream of the DC Transhumanists. My presentation for the DC Transhumanist-Party, and really excited about that. We're going to be talking about some of these same subjects to some degree, talking about our climate policy and these policy planks that we're going to be getting to tonight, but also introducing a lot of these folks here on the East Coast to the Futures New Deal for America and all of these important policy matters that we need to discuss. And none is more important than this discussion of climate science and these more robust and proactive approaches to reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We have to really begin to be doing a lot more than just these baseline regulatory matters that do not will not address the approach and will not address the problem in a timely enough fashion.
Yeah, you're in Split City up there. You've got half the city that's funded by the fossil fuel industries, and the other half of town is funded by the anti. I think the dominant player right there in Washington right now would be those fossil fuel guys. But the Silicon Valley people are starting to make an inroads, and you're part of that inroads. We want the USTP as part of its core values. We want electric vehicles, we want economical solar power, we want hydroelectricity, geothermal power, applications for sharing durable goods, AI, which can increase the efficiency of the power, a whole rapid transit, the vertical farming. All of these things have a positive impact on the environment. The environment is at the very core of the USTP values because we're symbiotic as humans. We're symbiotic with the environment. Without the environment, we won't have a planet to live on, and therefore longevity and health span goes down. So, Mr. Yeluashvili, you're the climate change guy. You're the one who's getting the appointment, not me. How are you? How's your post? I think you've been printed in the Newton Lee Transhumanist Handbook. How are you finding that? Are you campaigning on that? Are you giving people that link? And also, what else have you been up to?
Well, here's what's happening right now. The important thing broadly with climate change is to make it mainstream. And not only has that been happening in the public sphere, in American politics and beyond, but also in my personal life, I can tell you that I've been very active in promoting the climate change conversation, because a lot of people assume that it's a partisan issue, that it's an ideological issue with a conflict at its core of us versus them. Personally, I don't see it that way. I see it as a conflict of us versus our mutual failure of communication. And I believe the way to transcend that is to reach out to people across parties, across ideologies, and across backgrounds in order to find common ground on something we all value, which is the environment. Because even if somebody doesn't identify as a climate change advocate or is even skeptical that climate change exists, we all care about the environment in which we live.
Yeah, even the most ardent, most ardent skeptic cleans his room or cleans his house because they realize that having a clean house is important for their own mental health or something. I mean, these people don't advocate to have a messy home, or or they get upset when they walk down and they see people with a messy yard or something. I mean, these people understand it on a micro scale. It's they just think they have solutions. And Mr. Yeluashvili, we've seen recently in the climate change idea 2 or 3 things that have popped up. One, let's talk about the elephant in the room, Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg has appeared out of nowhere like a superhero, and she's scared the elites. She's got everyone running. She went on a boat as a media campaign. What do you think of Greta, and what do you think about her message, and what do you think about her impact? Is her impact being substantial, or is it a gust of wind and it's going to about to die?
Well, I think it's a symptom, one of many, of larger societal and political factors. Greta Thunberg is like many other people. She's frustrated with the environment in which we live, no pun intended, and she wants to make a change. Part of the reason she's becoming so mainstream in the media is actually because she's not working alone. She started her school strike against the climate by herself, but she's not getting on TV screens and in United Nations conferences alone. She's part of a group of activists that are also working to prevent climate change, and I recommend looking up some of their work as well. A good example of this is the native Canadian activist Autumn Peltier, who is also a young woman, much like Greta, who is interested in climate change prevention. And they're fighting very actively on the ground to raise awareness of this issue. I think raising awareness is good. I don't think it's the only thing to do, but it's a good start. My concern is twofold. Number one, a short-term plan to address climate change. Now, with regards to skepticism and denial of climate change, which is something I've encountered frequently, I would start with the following base, with the following ideological foundation. There are 2 possibilities for climate change. It's either a fact or it's a belief. If it's a fact, then it's true, and we need to prevent it. I can't think of anyone who would want climate change to happen. If it's a belief, then if we try to convince others that their beliefs are false, anyone with experience in politics can tell you that oftentimes this can be a Sisyphean labor, where you have the classic ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, the guy who was condemned to suffering in the afterlife, and he was pushing a boulder up the hill, and it kept rolling down on him infinitely. That's what it's like when you try to convince people that their core beliefs are false. Personally, that's not something I try to do. What I do try to do instead is to find common ground among different ideologies. And the transhumanist party is a good example of that, where you have people on the right wing, people on the left wing, you have atheists and religious people, rich and poor, young and old. They all come together to find something that they all value. And I think that's a good short-term plan for climate change prevention. To agree on something, for example, like geoengineering issues, which, as I've mentioned before, are compatible with many different political ideologies, and in the long term, to invest in solutions that work under a small government or under a big government. Nuclear power is a good example of this, especially a thorium fuel cycle, which is part of the discourse in the US Transhumanist Party.
Yeah, absolutely. Safe nuclear power is definitely one of the values of the USTP, and it's advocated, safe being the core word. Ben Zion, you're the candidate. Now you have some to and throwing. But let's talk about Greta Thunberg. Are you going to meet Greta? Do you dislike Greta? What is your opinion on Greta Thunberg? I just have to turn something off, but go ahead.
Yes. No, I mean, I could never dislike someone who has the courage of their convictions to stand against this great trial of our time, and everything about Greta in terms of messaging and organizing. It's incredible. It's an incredible accomplishment. At this time a year ago, she was a young woman standing alone with a single clapboard. And now 4 million people have marched in solidarity with her. And those 4 million people are precisely the people who need to hear Mr. Yeluashvili's message about what we can be doing more particularly to address this concern. You know, and we mentioned thorium energy. It came up in a strategy discussion with our friend and another advisor from the DOE, John Carricks. We all know him from the primary as well. We are working. All of us are working on policy planks to devise this concept of a bright green energy platform. You know, in contrast with the kind of defeatism or the kind of maybe not proactive enough solutions that we would see from other approaches, merely abstaining from certain activities, regulatory approaches. These type of approaches are extremely important, but they are not the only approaches. And we can go far beyond that with the kind of initiatives that Daniel Yeluashvili has articulated so wonderfully on my show and yours. And I'm so glad to have him as our climate science and geoengineering advisor for the Futurist New Deal for America. I think that we can be doing incredible things, getting this message to people and advancing this important scientific endeavor.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool endorsement, climate advisor. One of the things that I've always thought about, and I'm not sure, Mr. Climate Advisor Yeluashvili, wave power. What do you think of wave power? You like wave power, or is it inefficient?
Well, that's a good question, actually, because wave power and hydroelectric power have been tried before. In theory, it's a very good idea, especially on the coastlines where I live, because of the easy access to resources. I mean, water power is physically a lot easier to reach than, for example, electric power, which is based on the very expensive distribution of zinc, lithium, and nickel for car batteries, or for that matter, even nuclear power. But in practice, water power and wave power more specifically has a long way to go in terms of being applicable to the extent that fossil fuels or nuclear power are. There's a lot of innovation to do there. And I think that's effective as a long-term solution. As a short-term solution, focusing on more immediate options would be the way to go.
And those immediate options are?
Well, geoengineering, electric power, nuclear power, as I said, and especially solar power. Now, solar power also has some flaws. In fact, there's a great article about this by former gubernatorial candidate in California, Michael Schellenberger, who's actually said that solar power can be bad for the environment, and that depends on its application. Solar panels, in certain cases, can degrade in quality in rain, and a lot of the contents of these panels can actually leak out and be damaging to the environment. And that's very problematic, because it's being pushed by people who claim to care about the environment and about preserving nature. So a short-term solution would be to roll out more functional solar power alternatives. We need to move quickly And we need to draw attention to solar power companies and solar power producers more broadly that work, and not the solar power companies that don't work.
All right, yeah, because I wanted to go through each one of those, and since you started off on solar power, let's continue on solar power. So what are the practical implications for the USTP? What advice would you have for someone like Ben Zion or Gennady about solar power? What can they do to spice up the platform, the values of the platform concerning solar power? Now, you mentioned the fact that in the rain that these solar panels can leak bad toxins or bad elements that hurt the environment. I mean, I thought in my head, well, just put them out in the middle of the desert somewhere, which would limit the amount of environment. But then you get dust problems.
Yeah,
I can see how that's a problem. So, Earth-based solar panel, that's an issue. I mean, if you put solar panels on people's roofs, that's a commercial issue. People do that commercially to heat their water or something, or subsidize a little bit of power. But it's not until the efficiency of those cells come up. It's not the best return on investment. I mean, you don't cut your power bill in half or anything. You cut it down by 10% for quite a large investment, depending on how many panels you put on your roof and if the government is subsidizing them or not. The solar panels in space are probably your best option. There's no dust. It's 24/7. You don't get with the peaks during the peak hour, and then nothing at night where you have to, and you don't need batteries everywhere. So solar panels in space. What's your advice on solar power concerning some of these topics, some of these issues, to the USTP, to Ben and Gennady and others? Let's go through solar power.
sure. Well, I'm actually glad you mentioned setting up solar panels in the desert, because there's such an idea as solar farms, where much in the same way that in rural areas you have rows of wind turbines, one may also set up a farm, either government or privately owned, that contains rows of solar panels. And especially where I live in California, Napa Valley has a lot of space for this. At present, that space is being used to grow grapes for the wine that's very famously distributed there. But a lot of this rural space can be used to set up solar farms that would be able to serve, again, either as a public or private investment. That means that when governments change and they either implement more or less social welfare programs or more or less regulations, this industry can adapt over time. And that's really the core of the issue. Solar panels, and more broadly, the climate change prevention scheme, needs to be adaptable. You also mentioned solar panels on roofs. That's also important. What's important to consider is the neighborhood's value and the resale value of solar panels on houses. At times, they can actually attract or repel other people in the neighborhood depending on how they feel about those solar panels aesthetically. And I wish I could say aesthetics didn't matter. I really do, because we're talking about a planet-sized issue here. But it is important. I mean, look at wind turbines. A lot of aesthetic problems arise when wind turbines loom over farms and in tourist destinations, and birds crash into them. I mean, these are problems that we have to solve. And another thing about power, and this is getting away from solar power a little bit, there is such a phenomenon as solar water. When I say solar water, I mean water that is heated by solar panels and solar power more broadly. This is a technology that hasn't gotten a lot of investment, especially in the United States. The few examples that I can think of this are in Israel, Cyprus, and parts of the United States, but America could really use extended innovation of these technologies, especially, excuse me, my glasses fell apart, especially in landlocked American states. You look at Arizona, you look at New Mexico, I mean, you look at Oklahoma, there's a lot of space there to experiment with these technologies. And I think whether it comes from a free market perspective or a big government perspective, there's a lot of investment to do in this technology.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Israel. Israel's known as a solar power, like solar superpower, because it's kind of cool. All right, cool. Well, what do you think about that advice, Ben? Are you going to take any of that on board?
Oh yes, yes. I think that the thing that sets apart the United States Transhumanist Party and that sets apart the Futurist New Deal for America is that we are focused on solutionism. We are looking at always looking at how these grand challenges can be solved in the most pragmatic and utilitarian of terms, and that is something that the two-party system is. It's not one of their strengths. they're not always the best at doing that. And it's something that we can add to this conversation, even though we are not nearly so large an organization. It's something that people have a kind of a natural interest in transhumanism. It fascinates them, and we can use that fascination to drive these more important issues to center stage. And nothing is more important than making these kinds of arrangements that would allow us to survive the course of the 21st century. We need to do this. We owe it to coming generations. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to ourselves as longevity advocates. If we expect to live quite a bit longer, we will personally be seeing the fruits of these labors, and that's quite important. And I mentioned I was talking to John Carricks, who is advising on a similar set of subjects and also on space matters. And we're going to do a show, and we're also going to get his materials up as we are getting Daniel's materials up on our new website that's coming soon, and also on the USTP site. And the reason that I mentioned again this kind of synergy is that we have this exciting prospect of being able to, in the near term, having solar arrays in space. This is a reason that we have focused in the Futurist New Deal to a high degree on describing some near-Earth industrialization and near-Earth orbit initiative.
Oh, Ben's gone. Near-Earth industrialization and yeah, so cool. Near-Earth initiatives. Ben's, you back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Near-Earth
sure
industrialization, Near-Earth orbit initiative. That's where we hit you off.
Yeah. I apologize. I don't know what happened there. But just as we are able to be working in these near-Earth industrialization and contexts, this will facilitate our work in these other areas, as in developing solar arrays and other novel approaches to these kinds of problems. And some of them are on quite a grand scale. Some of them might not be on the same scale, but might still be conversations that we need to have in the concerns about aesthetics that Daniel mentioned a moment ago. I recall your previous interview and my interview with Daniel, where we talked about the use of iron to increase algal blooms in the ocean and foment ocean life. This is an interesting approach to a very real set of concerns about the health of our oceans, and we have to have these kinds of conversations about what we can do, what we want to do as a society, and ultimately, some tough choices need to be made. It might not. It shouldn't always come down to aesthetics. It comes down to, again, the survival of our species and all the species on this planet.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, if the party is advocating for things like electric vehicles, it's only going to increase the amount of strain and stress on the power grid. All these electric vehicles are going to be charged arguably at home or at power stations across the country, just like you have fuel stations now. So yeah, so there's a strain, for example, just coming from the autonomous vehicle or the vehicle market is going to only increase, and I can only imagine that even with transhumanist technologies, most of these technologies are going to be reliant on some form of electricity, some sort of power. So I can imagine that the amount of demand on the electricity grid is only going to rise. So you know, Mr. Yeluashvili, are you aware of Jose Cordero's energy singularity, where he's very much a proponent of solar power being at the core of an energy singularity?
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Cordero's work is invaluable in the transhumanist community, and it's a great example of what Mr. Ben Zion mentioned earlier with regards to bright green environmentalism, where I've also paid a lot of attention to this. There are three main schools of thought in the environmentalist movement. There's the light green, where people focus on lifestyle changes. Kamala Harris is a good example of this, where she made a big deal in the Democratic debates when she talked about banning plastic straws. There's dark green environmentalism, which unfortunately the American Green Party is very focused on. It's predominantly anti-establishment, very radical, and focused on attacking the system rather than working with it. And there's bright green environmentalism, which focuses on technology. And that's definitely our lane, I would say, if it's fair to speak for the transhumanist community. We believe in a synthesis of caring about the world in which we live and using technology to improve upon it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all right, cool. And we don't have Mr. Shatke anymore. He's just running around. But let's move on to nuclear power. So, nuclear power, Ethereum-based. Mr. Yeluashvili, advise us on nuclear power. What you think needs to be as part of this platform sweep, policy values sweep of the USTP. What would you have to advise Ben Zion, Gennady, and others?
Well, I would say a couple things. Number one, nuclear power is primarily fought against by two forces. Number one is big oil, and number two is dark green environmentalists. So the solution is primarily as follows. With regards to big oil, a core component of the conversation is financial. There need to be investment opportunities in nuclear power so that a lot of the primary investment in oil that happens right now can be easily transferred into nuclear energy and eventually, hopefully, a thorium fuel cycle. And I say thorium specifically because it's a lot more sustainable than uranium or plutonium, which of course have caused meltdowns in the past, like Chernobyl and Fukushima. That's going to be a useful talking point for any pro-nuclear advocate or activist, that a lot of these meltdowns have not happened because of nuclear power ipso facto. They've happened because nuclear power has been misused and misunderstood. We need to be able to attract investors with innovative new promises. That's how nuclear power is going to get off the ground. With regards to dark green environmentalism, I wish I could tell you I was optimistic, but I'm not. These are people who are driven by a sort of radicalism that refuses to compromise. For anyone who opposes nuclear power on the grounds that it somehow falls within the reach of a corrupt and unstable system, I can only say that technological advancements have improved a lot of the problems of society today, rather than hindering them. A good example of this is the Industrial Revolution, where, in fact, when trains were first invented, wood was used to fuel them. And very quickly, Britain, where a lot of this was taking place, began actively running out of forests. So what did people do? Did they despair? Did they say, well, we're running out of trees, better not use trains anymore? No, they didn't. They started using coal instead, and they invented fossil fuels. And that's going to happen again. The future, beyond wood, beyond coal, beyond oil, is nuclear.
And there's definitely more innovation to come in the nuclear industry, and there's especially when we get to space, I think that's where it gets really exciting. But at the moment, we're stuck here on Earth. So yes, Mr. Benzion, are you a fan of nuclear?
Absolutely, yes, and also emerging technology and that allows us to make better use of nuclear technology as thorium. We want to be pursuing that. I'll tell you that I'm a supporter of safe nuclear energy to such an extent that this week I and members of the DC Transhumanist-Party will be attending a pro-nuclear march here in Washington, D.C. We'll be there with bells on. We'll be there with clapboards, showing our support for this form of green energy.
Yeah, and the USTP emphasizes safe nuclear power, and
Yes.
there are mechanisms for safe nuclear power. I mean, there's a lot of plants out there in the world. There's been a lot of different attempts at nuclear energy, and there's only been one Chernobyl and one Fukushima. It doesn't always end up in disaster. The bad news always travels further than the good news in the nuclear industry, and unfortunately, the bad news is quite bad, and that's why people are adverse. But there are sufficient safety precautions that you can use. And I here in Australia. I've been a pro-nuclear person since 2012 or earlier. Is when I started to research it and read about it, and I've always kind of fell on the side of I can't see why this is a bad thing, and the pro-nuclear side is starting to gain steam now, which is encouraging. It is kind of worrying because we do want to emphasize the safety side of things. We don't want it to go wrong. You don't want it to be rushed. You don't want mishaps. You don't want anything. But it is encouraging to see that the actual nuclear power debate is starting to change at a time when Europe and America seem to be waning on the nuclear issue in some respects. Europe, Germany, for example, is shutting down all their plants by 2022 or something. It's an interesting time for nuclear energy. I'm not sure what's happening, whether or not it's a rebirth or a shutting down of the old system, or different needs changing for different parts of the world. I'm not sure. There's geopolitics as well, but it's a very interesting time for nuclear, and will be very exciting to see what happens in the future. And all the best with your march there. Get lots of photos. Go with the people, and lots of thumbs up. And we'll see. And you can inbox Mr. Shaki some of those photos as well. You might even see him there. He might fly down from wherever he is and come and join you in the.
Sure, it'd be great to see him.
He's watching. He always watches. He's a good guy. Hopefully he'll have lots to say. And I've built up an independent relationship with him, and I'll talk to him about nuclear power. But anyway, So, Miss Yeluashvili, what else is on the buffet? What else is on the menu for energy? What else would you recommend that the USTP focus on for an energy complex? We'll get to your carbon capture last, but what else should we talk about before then?
Sure. Well, there's a couple things. Number one, so far we've talked about positive aspects of the environmentalist movement. I would also like to focus briefly on where some environmentalist voices have actually gone wrong. I'll give you a concrete example. In the Democratic Party debates, again, and leading up to them as well, Senator Kamala Harris has actually called to ban offshore oil drilling. Now, obviously, fracking and oil drilling are bad for the environment, but there's an unseen side effect to such policy. More specifically, a lot of the oil that America drills for and controls is hotly contested. It's in disputed territory with the Russian Federation. And Russia is also drilling for oil in order to bolster its own economy. Now, economically, Russia is known for being what's called a hot house, where it produces its own goods, it restricts free trade, it restricts economic globalization. And never mind the political or cultural aspects of globalization, those are, I'll set those aside for the moment, but economically, when a country as massive as Russia does not join trade agreements like the United States does, like Europe does, like Australia does, that causes problems. Because, Steele, as I mentioned on your show the first time we spoke, when you have a leader of a country like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil get into certain forms of corruption and general malfeasance, trade agreements are a way to hold other governments accountable. So what we're seeing here is not just an economic choice, it's a resistance to accountability. So if a country wants to ban offshore oil drilling, it needs to find a way to prevent other countries from doing that as well. We need balance, and we need a way to take precautions for the unaccountable and amoral among us.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analysis. Geopolitics always gets in the way of sound policy. You always have international agreements, treaties, personalities. You always have an inflection of culture and ideas, and it always gets in money and into corporate relationships, and it always gets very messy at the international level, and what you should do to play off what. I mean, obviously, banning fracking and offshore drilling is extremely detrimental to American energy independence, which is one of the stated goals. It's it's not. It's okay for the petrodollar cycle, I guess, but that's a dying argument now. It's old, it's dying, it's whatever. But American energy independence, energy security is at the core of some of that focus, and she's not going to win. She's not going to become the president by going against the Alfalfa Club or whatever. So, So environmental, I'm not sure. Geopolitical, military strategy, geopolitical strategy, What I think is a good policy option when it comes to forcing, instead of the government forcing out some of these big geopolitical issues, pressure from below. So, for example, the BP oil spill, that was a good one. That gets the not that it was a good event. None of these oil spills are any good event, but they're good to get a groundswell of pressure, and also pressure from international organizations like the United Nations, UNESCO, World Heritage people, whoever, and just other countries and like Mexico or something, who other countries who say they could do a better job or want the contracts or want the drilling rights or whatever. These are always good for bottom-up pressure and top-down pressure. These are more natural events than just a government going out of the way and messing up geopolitical factors for quote-unquote stated environmental goals, right? But I agree with you on that. But what I think is an answer, what I think is something that can be done, is innovation on the commercial sector for consumption by normal people. So we mentioned briefly, we talked about solar panels on the roof of somebody's house, but what about this notion of just cutting off the amount of cutting down the amount of intake per household on a grandiose scale, innovations in efficiencies on devices, on home consumable goods, even on commercial goods, just in people's daily jobs. I mean, if we have innovations at that level just to reduce the amount of impact on the grid, is that a good idea, Mr. Yeluashvili?
Yeah, a good and a very easy way to do that is to actually cut down on, and this kills me to say because I'm a foodie and I love various exotic foods, but fish and various forms of seafood, and especially red meat, any kind of meat, but especially red meat, tend to have a high carbon footprint, and they tend to be fairly harmful for the environment. What I recommend for all the viewers of Detonation out there is to look into the Seafood Watch program. Seafood Watch is an app, and I make this sound like a sponsorship, but I'm actually really passionate about it. Seafood Watch is an app that catalogs all the good, bad, and mediocre forms of seafood that one can ingest. So when you plan out your day-to-day dietary habits and what you buy at the store, this will give you an opportunity to look at where your meat and fish come from, whether they're wild or they're farmed, because that's another major source of environmental damage, fish farming. Because when a fish, I'll give you an example, salmon. When salmon grow up on a farm, oftentimes the fertilizer that is used to raise and feed them is flushed away into the ocean through sewage systems and other irrigation systems. And all that fertilizer mixes with the water and the other waste, and it negatively affects oceanic life. And because of that, the oceanic life in the surrounding area tends to die off. And an easy way to prevent that from happening is when you eat meat, maybe consider tofu or beans. I was going to say soy. I'm not a particularly big fan of soy, but that's an option too. Something that preserves both environmental friendliness and, dare I say, love for carnivorous diets, and it's something that does not look, look like something you'd find in the back of a Toyota Prius, is what's called the Impossible Burger. There's a couple locations now. San Francisco here has several where Impossible Burgers are being sold. And these are burgers that look, feel, and taste exactly like regular burgers made of meat. But they're
very good.
Plant-based. And guess who's investing in them? Major meat producers. So that sets a precedent for large industries to change their minds about what they invest in and reconsider whether or not their practices are environmentally friendly. Today, we take big meat. Tomorrow, we take big oil.
So there you go.
Yes.
There you go, Ben. We've got an interview for you on the Futurist New Deal. We got to go up to the creator, the team, and or the person who's made this app, this seafood app, and go and talk to them.
Yeah. That's an incredibly important work that they're doing, and also these faux beef and ultimately lab-grown beef products both are incredibly important to reducing our collective carbon footprint and impact on our use of water and other resources. You know, Carl's Jr., this company, and Burger King, they've each sold millions of these products. And every one of those that's consumed, that's an awful lot less land in the Amazonian rainforest that's being destroyed through these millions of. So this is an important step that we need to take, and it does come down to consumers. The light approach, the light energy approach is of importance. But we need to have all of these tools at our disposal in this. And moments ago, Daniel was talking a little bit about this sort of law of unintended consequences in the context of the industrialization and factory farming that we're doing. We don't see how this is having ripple effects in other areas with the water table and so forth. There are all of these kind of concerns with our bright futurism as well. We have to consider that some of these things do have implications for we might have law of unintended consequences effects. That's why we need a lot more people working on this. You know, at RadFest, Ray Kurzweil did a presentation where he spoke in a word about predictive algorithms that can help us game out some of these scenarios. so that we can determine what is the best course of action when looking at these sorts of things. Because, for example, in the use of iron in algal blooms, we don't know with absolute certainty that there might not be some drawbacks. We don't know that some of these things might not have potentially some kinds of whatever the case may be. If you look at 100 implementations, certain of them will have trade-offs in them, and we need to have a lot of heads on this, a lot of eyes on this, and we need to have the use of more advanced tools like these predictive algorithms. It's why after this program, we're going to have this AI safety and AI advisor, Dan Elton, talking about how all of these disciplines should be integrated with advanced algorithms at the highest level.
Fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to seeing Dr. Dan Elton again. Always really good. Ben, we talked just briefly about geopolitics as well. Mr. Yeluashvili raised the idea of Kamala Harris, right? Who was talking about offshore drilling. You're talking about law of unintended consequences. What do you think about that? I mean, you're running for president. I mean, would you ban all offshore drilling? I mean,
it is a feature. It is a feature of the Futurist New Deal to be taking these regulatory approaches. As we said, there these different approaches, the more robust regulatory approaches, the concerns with personal habits. And also these features that we see more in the transhumanist community, the bright green energy movement. These all have an important role to play. And so yes, there is, I believe, a place for and also if the public has an interest, a strong interest in these regulatory matters, it may be enough of a political will to overcome these powerful moneyed special interests that would tend to dampen or inhibit or otherwise circumvent that. So it is important for people to have this conversation, to take this stand. But we should be open to all approaches and pursuing the course of least resistance because the clock is ticking. We do have to keep working on these matters in every and every conceivable way that we might.
Yeah, this is a good point. Mr. Yeluashvili, all right, let's talk about carbon capture and geoengineering. Let's talk about that. So just open up for us very simply, what is carbon capture, what is geoengineering, and then we'll work from there.
Sure. Well, geoengineering is an umbrella term for a number of different technologies that aim to prevent climate change, not solely by reducing existing carbon emissions, but by removing the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are already present in the atmosphere. More specifically, carbon sequestration and carbon capture technologies are artificial means of removing CO2, and in the case of carbon sequestration, storing it in pockets underground, and in the case of carbon capture, simply storing it inside the machinery that would be used to do this. A possible byproduct of this technology, which I mentioned at my presentation for the Transhumanism Handbook in Los Angeles at the Wellness and Longevity Seminar,
great talk.
That had to do with some technology coming out of China right now, where certain technological advances present in China today have actually managed to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and condense it into blocks of carbon, where these blocks are then used perhaps to build houses or other structures. So this is not only a form of climate change prevention, it's also a form of recycling.
Very cool.
Thank you. I would also like to add that this isn't something I've brought up before, but I think now is a good time to say it. I've been very vocal about this issue, and I've gotten some mixed feelings, some positive, but very largely actually negative from the radical left on this, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, for example, argues very strongly for the reduction of CO2 emissions. Now, a lot of climate change legislation does this. The Paris Accords do this. The Obama administration's Clean Power Plan did this. But when you argue for the reduction of CO2 emissions without removing what's already there, this creates a problem, because businesses that are alienated and feel like they're under attack are going to push back in a reactionary manner, for example, through the use of major media outlets and corporate influence. I'm thinking particularly of Rupert Murdoch and of the Koch brothers, who are very adept at this, and that really causes more problems than it solves. So anytime the conversation turns to the Green New Deal or other climate change legislation, I'm very focused on the idea that we need to focus on geoengineering first and long-term solutions second. Because in order to have long-term solutions to any problem, including climate change, you need to have short-term solutions first.
Short-term solutions first. I like it. I think I agree with that approach. I think consumer level for me, it starts there. But I think we can make some rapid change with some of these carbon capture technologies. I mean, especially if you can use it to convert it to building materials, because there's certain countries all around the world, in Africa and Latin America, some in Asia now. A lot of the world is advancing very quickly, but there's still room that we could build cities off this stuff rather than going about the traditional method and making even more of a mess. This is the thing. We want to skip development path. We want to skip development trajectories, and we don't want to go through the same problem. And we've had Africa panels on here. We didn't specifically talk about it, but we could, the first world should assist these countries with the use of some of these technologies to just jump ahead with the internet, jump ahead with carbon capture, so that we could not only fix some of the problems in the first world, but I'll make sure that the second and third, or however they describe it nowadays, don't get impacted by the negative development paths that we know are good for GDP, are bad for the environment, bad for socioeconomics, bad for everything else that you have to go through. In Australia, for example, we had a huge asbestos problem, and we don't want to. It's like putting asbestos all over everything again. We don't have to do that. We can skip some of these development paths. What do you think, Ben Zion? Geoengineering, are you in favor?
Oh yeah. That's the thrust of this meeting here today. I am in favor of it. The Futurist New Deal supports it. We want to incorporate it into the policy initiatives under the Transhumanist New Deal. That's why I was so pleased when Daniel agreed to be our geoengineering advisor and to be helping us to disseminate these materials and ideas to the larger population. And I look forward to doing more programs of this kind because this is a subject that is not only important, but it also captures the imagination. And it's a way that people can think about the good work that techno-optimists want to do and can do, and all of the things that we bring to the table as forward-thinking folks. So I am very much in support of geoengineering, and I think that the more people that we have working on the initiatives of these kinds, the better kind of outcomes we can expect to see. I want to say something about what you said a moment ago about the developing world, which you mentioned that we have a certain kind of duty to see this, and this is not merely some moralism. There's a very real sense in which when countries like the United States or the UK were going through the growing pains of industrialization, we didn't have these regulatory standards and societal mores that we have today, and to some degree that facilitated this industrialization. So we owe it. We don't want to handicap these other folks. And also, there's been other forms of capping, taking of resources from the developing world, and this continues to this day. So we have a duty to see that we allow these emerging technologies to benefit folks who haven't had the benefit of industrialization for these reasons.
Yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And Mr. Yeluashvili, can you tell us your favorite can you tell us your favorite technologies within this sector? Because I remember in your PowerPoint you had a few different proposals. What would be something you would tell the USTP that they should focus on as some of your pet favorites?
Sure. Well, I can think of a few. I primarily recommend looking into the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, because they've been talking a lot about geoengineering and its possibilities. MIT, Yale, and surprisingly enough, or perhaps not surprisingly, Elon Musk have all contributed in a significantly valuable fashion to this conversation. So I would recommend looking into their work. More broadly, with regards to the type of technology we're talking about, in essence, artificial trees are the way to go, because the easiest way to prevent climate change from metastasizing is to plant trees. Now, there's a problem with this, obviously. Not all land is arable, and not all arable land is available. So what do you do with large amounts of land where you can't necessarily plant trees? Well, it's very simple. You put artificial trees there, you sequester or capture the carbon in the atmosphere, and that becomes an effective short-term solution to climate change. This could be coupled with lifestyle changes, like you were saying, Steele, such as focusing on environmentally friendly diets, and on modulating one's water and electricity usage. And this would all precede long-term solutions such as nuclear power and other transhumanist options.
Yeah, the rise of smart homes. I mean, that's where the developed world should go. They should start developing smart homes. There's a lot of inadvertent waste when people just leave a light on, or there's a dripping tap, or there's inefficiencies in because your gadgets are consuming too much power. And on an individual level it doesn't mean much, but as a collective over a country such as yours, the size of 375 million people, or China, 1.342, whatever the numbers are too big they can't even calculate it. India as well. The rise of smart homes alleviate some of that problem. Industrial waste, it was also a huge issue, and I think it's the offset of this industrial waste is what we're talking about, because you have an industrial problem, you have an industrial solution. The smart homes, that's transhumanist in the fact that they go hand in hand with longevity as well, because you're looking at it's basically incorporating longer lifespans, smart functioning toilets and the other things that come out of that. But for example, in Australia, we used to have a huge problem with water consumption, because you had really inefficient sanitation systems where they didn't really angle the water, so you'd flush. In America, you have this too. I went to America, and you flush the toilet, and it's just huge amounts of water, right?
Yeah.
There's huge amounts of water, and it just all goes down the drain. But when you actually angle the water, you can use a tenth of that much, and it does the same job. So just a little efficiencies like that. But for what we're talking about, yeah, I agree that industrial solutions for industrial sized problems, and this is really important as well. Mr. Yeluashvili, I was going to ask you as well, because I know we're running. I think we're running out of time. I'm not sure what the time is over there, but
We
Half an hour.
have more time.
half an hour. Okay, cool. All right, so I was going to ask you, have you got a headline that the USTP could run? Have you got some sort of multi-billion-dollar project that the USTP can throw out there to the media as a bone and say, this is what we're pushing? Your PowerPoint, you had some big industrial-sized projects there. Is there something that you can give to the Benzion 2020 campaign to say, we're looking to invest $20 billion in X, $1 billion in Y, $16 million in Z, A, B,
Yeah.
C?
Absolutely. I can think of a couple things. Number one, obviously, would be investment in carbon capture technologies and artificial trees. This is feasible hypothetically, but in practice, the money for that isn't just going to come out of thin air. We need to attract trendsetters and early adopters, people who are willing to buy into this from the get-go. And the obvious place to look for a lot of people would be activist organizations, political organizations. I'll throw out a surprising option: religious organizations. There's a lot of money in attracting religious organizations to political issues. In fact, there was a church just recently I believe it was Indiana, that paid off a lot of the healthcare debts of its congregants. And a lot of religious organizations are willing to go for this. The Episcopalian Church, the World Union of Progressive Judaism, a lot of evangelical churches. The religious sphere in the United States, when it comes to politics, is thought of as an obstructionist force. Sometimes that's true, and other times it's an opportunity for cross-party collaboration. So reaching out to these organizations and saying that, look, investing in geoengineering is the way to go is a good first step. Secondly, like I said, nuclear power and the thorium fuel cycle as a means of powering entire cities is, again, a long shot, but it's feasible. After all, everything's a long shot until it isn't. Like I was saying earlier, a lot of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution seemed improbable, if not downright impossible, before they occurred. But they ended up being a reality. Something I haven't yet mentioned, but will mention now, is the Hyperloop. Elon Musk was actually going to build a train from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and it would be environmentally friendly, it would be zero net emissions, and it would be much faster and more efficient than a lot of the traffic that builds up around here. Regrettably, the project was shut down, but I think it's worth investing in, especially in a time of mass deregulation and rollbacks from the federal government. Because like I said, I don't see this as a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. I see this as a global issue. It's something everyone can agree on, provided that we agree on shared values. I would also like to take this opportunity to say that lifestyle environmentalism, what's called light green environmentalism, is a huge benefit as well. And a good way to sell that is to combine it with short-term and long-term solutions. The alternative here, and this is something we'd want to avoid, is what's called performative activism. Now, very ideologically driven activists tend to call certain forms of activism performative when they appear to simply be driven by the idea of attracting attention. We don't want to give that impression. We're not here to attract attention. This isn't about us. It's about the future. It's about the planet. A good way to alleviate that is to propose it all at once as a bundle and to build a broad cross-party, cross-ideology coalition to say that, look at our, we can say, look at our plans. They all fit together. Look at all the people supporting it. That's a good way to bring it into the mainstream and not make it seem fringe.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ben, did you want to respond to that?
Yes. Well, I would definitely say that of all of the things that we've described in near future and slightly further future approaches to geoengineering, the carbon capture is the one that has the best benefits in terms of harm reduction, and it has the least. Perhaps by far the least other concerns of the law of unintended consequences, the kind of thing, any other possibility of other existential risks or other risks deriving from that. So this is an extremely important tent post. An extremely important part of this platform for this policy plank for our climate science and geoengineering approach. And I'm very thankful to know someone like Dan, who's done so much research and given so much thought to this subject, and been so kind to contribute that work product to our humble undertaking here at the Futurist New Deal for America. But all of these approaches merit discussion. They merit further research, and this is the best that we can be doing as an organization, is to be bringing these questions to the people and encouraging a bright discourse on this subject.
Yeah, and you know, yeah, you're right, and Mr. Yeluashvili, it's encouraging that you've put so much time and effort into this, and it's really good that you've given your efforts over to the Benzion 2020 campaign to try and support that campaign, and yeah, we really enjoy that. I was just thinking about the Hyperloop actually. Was it a train, or was it, because I've heard conspiracies that it wasn't a train at all. It was because electric cars run better in tunnels, right? So it would have been a better solution for his electric vehicles to have basically their own like tunnel thing, tunnel entity. Was it a train, or I heard there was a train involved, but was the Hyperloop all about trains, or was it a sneaky Elon electric vehicle thing?
Yeah, well, we all know that Elon has his mysterious pet projects floating around. What you're describing here seems to be two separate projects, where there was a train, and yes, there was also an attempt to build a tunnel for electric cars and other cars trying to move quickly, to move more efficiently from place to place. Now, this is true for a lot of places, but San Francisco especially has a lot of pressure from below against major technological innovations. The concern by a lot of these people and a lot of these institutions is that while the wealthy will have access to these shortcuts in transportation and technology, the poor will be left behind. Now, for me, I would say this all depends on implementation, and I would be wary of the influence of, as we were saying, dark green environmentalism and other forms of radicalism. But we do need to work with the people and assure them that this is not an issue of us versus them. As I was saying before, it's an issue of us versus our collective miscommunications.
Yeah, us versus our, miscommunication. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you think, like, because what makes the USTP attractive to environmentalists? Because should be attractive to environmentalists. What makes it attractive for environmentalists, and is there a messaging issue that we can clean up that can encourage more environmentalists to jump on board the USTP? We have a big focus on longevity, but that's not everything. I mean, it's all tied in together. What can we do, Daniel, to encourage environmentalists to come towards the USTP, to join up, to get on board, to do what you're doing, to attend conferences, to help out Benzion 2020?
Sure. Well, there is an untapped market in the world of environmentalism, and I don't think it's been fully claimed by any political party, and that's the needs and concerns of Indigenous peoples. Now, the political situation with Aboriginals in Australia, the First Nations in Canada, and the natives of the United States are all different. I'm not an expert on Indigenous people's rights, although it is an issue that I follow and I'm curious about. I would say that reaching out to supporters of Indigenous people's rights and even to Native American communities about the transhumanist message is important, because it could harm the appearance of the USTP to look very quote unquote, first world and very Western, because a lot of environmentalist voices that are otherwise very impactful and very willing to listen to alternative points of view get turned off by that. They say, oh, we don't feel included in this space, we're going to leave. I was mentioning earlier the activism of Autumn Peltier, which is a lot less famous than the activism of Greta Thunberg, even though they're happening at the same time and come from the same source. If we're able to capture the conversation of land management and Indigenous peoples interacting with non-Indigenous populations like ours, we don't have to take a radical position to attract audiences that we haven't before. It's a matter of networking. I think if we look in corners where a lot of political parties aren't, especially where they're pretending to, I'm thinking of the "You Are on Native Land" campaign, where a lot of people talk about living on native soil without even knowing a single Native American or inviting a Native American to such campaigns. If we mitigate all that, if we reach out to audiences that most political parties are ignoring, that could be a plus for us. Micronations are a good start as well. The Transhumanist Party has already done this, reaching out to proponents of micronations and seasteads would be a plus for us as well, because that's not an issue claimed particularly by any party, but it is something people care about.
Yeah, and a lot of those micronations are at the forefront of climate change, aren't they? I mean, Micronesia, Samoa, Tonga, all those little islands out there in the Pacific. Even you have your own state of Hawaii, which will be on the front line, for example. And then you have, other issues, to do with climate change with Tornado Alley, Florida. I mean, if you go on the bigger ones, but these are untargetable at the moment. I agree. Indigenous rights campaigns. It's quite easy to get into that voice and to make sure that they know that the Transhumanist-Party is a humanist party, and that it's not just a Western chauvinist party or anything like that. It's something that transcends the boundaries of race, religion, ethnicity, nationalism, all that. It transcends all that. It goes way above that, and and these people should feel included. They shouldn't have their voices locked out. Microstates, or not microstates, but states like Israel, for example, are very important, very technologically advanced. They have a lot to say. They just don't have a lot of room to maneuver there. For example, San Marino, is another one. Very, very good one we could connect with. Estonia is another one we could connect with. And there are islands such as Cuba and others in that Caribbean area that are already getting impacted by climate change. Haiti is another one that's being impacted negatively. And these people should know that there's a new movement afoot in the United States, and they have solutions to avert the smoggy darkness of negative climate change, of negative, of worse storms, bigger tornadoes, rising sea levels, all the negative impacts that rancid climate change will have on coastal populations, on coastal cities, and on agriculture, on the economy as a whole. There are significant. There are the little doggy in the background. There are significant advantages to.
You can just hit the mute button.
Yeah, there are significant advantages to the USTP getting the voice out there. Ben Zion, you're the voice now. You're getting out there and trying to connect with these communities, and on a humanist level, which is part of it's in the name, right? But you focus on the trans or the humanist, but we can talk to these communities and say we actually have humanist right there in the very first title, a section of our name. It's right there in the title. It says humanist, and we go beyond, and we're here to help.
Yes, and you can't have one without the other, certainly. I think that it's incredibly important to describe this in earthbound terms, in a positive light. There is this, I think, people low information individuals and this people who tended to cursorily dismiss techno-optimism. They have a view that we are a mouthpiece of a wealthy elite, of a tech elite, and that is why we've worked on these policy planks for specific initiatives that are focused on solutionism, that are focused on near-term solutions of this kind, because we know what we are, and we know that we can be doing this good work. And we've talked quite a lot about these other movements, these other forces, and we are not something at the scale of the larger environmental movement. We are not something at the scale of these lobbies that we want to hopefully steer in a better direction, and these party mechanisms that we want to steer in a better direction. But what we are, and what we have been as U.S. Transhumanist Party, is sort of a small fish at the center of that school of fish that's been able to guide it, and that's true to a high degree. Our friend Zoltan Istvan has run on policy matters like a basic income, which are now largely policy doctrine within the Democratic Party, and we could point to others of this kind. And this is owing to us being a little more prescient and being able to drive that school of fish in a little bit in the right direction. And it's something that we can do in this context of carbon capture and other novel approaches to this very real climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Zoltan has done a lot of work he's speaking through the Democrats at the moment. You can hear it, especially with Andrew Yang, especially with some of the UBI stuff. He's made an impact right up into the world stage, and it's really encouraging. It's really fun to see, especially from down here. Hey, Yeluashvili, I thought. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that there's also a Yang Gang meetup here in DC this week. Coming up, and so I will get to meet Andrew Yang. I'm going of RSVP to that. A few of our DC futurists are going to be in attendance as well, who are also interested in the Yang campaign. I have had a strong interest all along in this. I see a lot of transhumanist and techno-progressive values reflected in this gentleman and in his platform, and I'm looking forward to getting to shake his hand.
Good, and get a selfie, and then you send that one straight to Haywire. That's really good. Andrew Yang has he's hit on a chord with a certain demographic of people who look beyond superficial Trumpian reasons for things happening. And it is at the core of there's at the core is automation, to some of these issues. It's the way the economic system has been set up is it's not it's an industrial economy. It's a manufacturing economy that they want to come back, and that economy is all automated now. And the USTP encourages further automation, but it doesn't just encourage automation without just for the sake of automation. It encourages automation so that people are freed up to do other things. You don't want people sitting on a production line churning out widgets all day. That's destructive to the human mind. It stumps creativity. It's boring. It's socially deflating. And it doesn't, it doesn't do anything. If you can do a machine to do that and let that person write novels all day, or go and start their own detonation, or work out problems to climate change, or solutions to health and biotechnology, or invest their efforts into nanotechnology, or become a computer programmer. If they could do something else with their time, and instead of, being on the end of a production, being a part of a machine on a production facility, I mean, you're getting America in better shape to compete in the 21st century. And America has not, it built the modern world, and yet it's not set itself up to compete for the modern world. And this is what Andrew Yang is hitting on. He's hitting on this notion that, this is the reason, this is the real core reason why there's disenfranchisement. And Trump knows that, but a lot of the populists know that. Even Bernie Sanders arguably knows some of that stuff, but they throw out these other dog whistles the other way, and to rally populist support for political gain. And it's disingenuous. These both extremes are being disingenuous. So we, as the Transhumanist Party and as transhumanists, we have to say that there is a better way, and there is something else out there, and there's a real reason. And Andrew Yang, luckily, or by strategy of the Democratic Party, either one, it's smart whatever they've done there, is hitting on that chord, and they're setting themselves up as the party that has those principles locked down, which is, after Trump, in a post-Trumpian world, whether that be in 10 days or in 6 years, or whatever, 4 years or whatever, 6 years, I don't know how long Trump's, but anyway, he's setting that party on a path that they won't be able to suddenly switch back to these talking points. They won't. The Republicans, after, they can only talk about strength and vigor, and they can only blame the other, and that will be fine, because by then you'll probably have so many enemies that, it's an easy argument. But at the same time, I mean, they can't actually talk about these real issues and these real problems the same way the Democrats will be able to. And so, it's probably a Democrat future, and they've probably...
And a transhumanist future.
Well, yeah, I mean, on a national level, but yeah, we want it to be a transhumanist future. And Gennady Stolyarov II, chairman, he came on and he said 2036 or 2030 or somewhere around there, these two parties will be kaput, because they can't play these games, and transhumanism, the Transhumanist Party, and or a derivative of, will rise above. And I mean, that's at the core. Hitting the right chord on climate change is, one of these issues. And Mr. Yeluashvili, you're out there rallying the people. You're out there doing all the great work. I wanted to just ask you, by the way, vertical farming, yay or nay, and or what should we do about vertical farming? Because vertical farming seems to be something that is definitely steamrolling, and it could be very, very beneficial to the future of big cities, yeah?
Yeah. Yes, I support vertical farming. And to give you some context, there are some vertical farming projects that are actually starting up here in San Francisco as we speak. A good example of this is some of the architecture, where on the side of a wall you'll have various forms of foliage, primarily moss and lichen, that are grown not only for aesthetic appeal, but more importantly as a means of being environmentally friendly and attracting local flora and fauna. This could also be an efficient source of self-sufficiently produced food, where people can grow vegetables in a little vegetable garden on a balcony or on the roof or what have you. And there's even a museum here with what's called a living roof, where there's a roof on which people can walk and take pictures and so on. It's fully accessible to tourists, and there's vegetation there that partially actually provides solar power. Not the vegetation itself, of course, but there's a combination of solar power and vegetation that grows on the roof, and this is used as an environmentally friendly resource. So in conclusion, yes, I do support vertical farming, and I think that's part of the new future that we're hoping to see.
Do you know any of the companies that are investing in vertical farming? Do you know the names of any of those companies by any chance?
I'll get back to you. It's pretty nascent, and a lot of this stuff is coming from the individual level, but I will keep you updated.
Yeah, even if it's from the individual level, I'd love to see the Benzion 2020 campaign communicate and talk to some of these vertical farmers, because as cities expand and as they want to become more self-sufficient and they want to reduce their footprint of importing trucking goods around all the time, even marginally. I mean, these are going to be great innovations, and there's also a huge leap forward in Singapore, for example, where vertical farming is doing very well. But I don't think it'll just stop there. Apart from America, where I think I can see it doing very well and proliferating across your giant cities over there, I could see vertical farming doing really well in the Middle East, in Dubai, in Saudi Arabia, in Dakar, in Israel. I could see vertical farming doing well. I could see vertical farming doing well in South Africa, for example. Plenty of places around the world where I could see a proliferation and a real use of vertical farming to try and become more self-sufficient, more sustainable, to reduce the footprint. Sustainability, yes, to improve sustainability and security, all at the same time. And local mayors would like that, regional gubernatorial governors or whatever, they'd like that. So hey, we're running out of time, but Mr. Yeluashvili, well done on your appointment. It's really, really cool. Keep connecting with these people. Keep telling us how to talk to the environmentalist movement, because we're the natural landing place. We're it. Like if they want real solutions to climate issues and climate problems, the Transhumanist-Party is the only place to go. So they just need to know this now. So thank you for all your hard work. Well done again on your beautiful PowerPoint. I think if you can, come up with some big number figures so we can run that in the media. So Benzion and the Ustp want $18 billion in X, $20 billion plan by 2030, or whatever. See if we can just get some numbers out there that gets the people talking. And thank you so much for coming on. And well done again on your being published in Newton Lee's Transhumanist Handbook. That's fantastic, and thank you very much again. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And if you have an insight or concern about geoengineering, about novel approaches to the climate crisis, reach out to myself. Anyone can reach me at benzion2020@gmail.com. You can reach out to Daniel Yeluashvili. You can reach out to Gennady Stolyarov, who has written quite extensively on the subject as well, and he's involved with these undertakings at many levels. So feel free. This is about a conversation. It's about advancing and organizing, and that's something that in which we can all play a part.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. That's a detonation where we're putting death out of business. We're trying to mainstream transhumanism as well. That's the primary goal. That's Mr. Yeluashvili, and that's candidate Benzion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, fellas.